Well, I hope everybody had a good lunch. Thank you, Lord. Well, we're going to, I will do my best to keep you guys awake. Okay. I know that up to this point, some of you have said I've not been excited enough, that I've not given you enough energy, so I'll try to do a little bit more for you here today. I got to get into it. I know, I'm not excited enough. So, this afternoon we want to talk. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you to do something? Can you make it really clear what you are talking about with the upper and lower house? Yeah. Just make that clear what you mean by that.
Which way specifically are you talking?
What do they mean, the upper house and the lower house? I mean, is it one of them is when they've got control of things and the other one is when they don't? I mean, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, that's exactly what we've talked about with the upper and lower house. Again, last night, this morning, that the lower house is when they are in the house of the unbeliever, so therefore they don't have control. So in Europe, and we'll talk about this a little bit here in this presentation when we talk about the resettlement aspect. When they have control, meaning the brotherhood speaks of infiltration into the media, the government, the churches, the schools. When they have a certain population base, which we'll talk about here as well, then they believe they're primed to go to the upper house. So the decision to go to the upper house has multiple factors, and it comes from within the Islamic community. It's not something that you and I would decide, but it's them deciding that we've gained that foothold. And they don't need 50% of the population. They don't need 20% of the population. In fact, according to internal Muslim Brotherhood documents, there's a guy named Chris Gobbets who actually infiltrated CARE as an intern, wrote a book called The Muslim Mafia, which CARE tried to sue from being published and lost, fortunately, and it was published. They'll say that, look, we think with 8 to 10% of the population base, we can go from the lower house to the upper house. And it depends on the level of influence. Well, we had infiltration of the Brotherhood under the Clinton administration, under the Bush administration, but nothing like what we saw under Obama. Nothing. So they determine, and the call is based upon strength. When they feel they have inroads and strength, population base, power centers, then they can transition to that upper house. When they go to the upper house, like in Europe, what you'll see tonight when I talk a little bit about Islam's assault on the Constitution, there's a video I'm going to hope if I have time to play for you, just to show you some examples of what's going on in Europe. When they go to the upper house now, all the early verses are abrogated. Muslims are commanded to live by the latter verses. And now they press upon non-Muslims, meaning that they're much more bold with implementation of compliance to Sharia. We see in Great Britain, in some of these enclaves, Muslim Sharia patrols walking around, telling people this is a Sharia-controlled zone. They have posters that they put on the walls. This is a Sharia-controlled zone. They're much bolder. So again, just to understand, the determination is while we're in the house of the unbeliever and we don't have strength, we're in this lower house and we can operate this way. Once we get to the upper house and that call comes when they feel that they have the strength, then the call comes, now we are in the upper house and we must live accordingly. And that's why you see in Europe where the intentions of the Islamists are not hidden anymore. They're flat out telling Europeans it's just a matter of time before we take you over. In fact, you'll see in a video here from a leading cleric from Al-Aqsa Mosque talking about what they're going to do to Europe, what their intentions are. So I hope that makes sense. And again, we'll keep trying to add that as we go. So it's the lower upper house is a complicated issue because there's multiple factors that we have to keep our eyes on, but the determination comes from them of when they feel they're ready to declare. Obviously, if they declare too soon, they could lose their being hidden, right? They can expose their plans if they declare too soon. So good question, and hopefully we'll keep clarifying that. Now, remember before the break, I mentioned to you that we're going to define jihad, because when we talk about refugee resettlement, you're going to see it's a part of jihad. And I do want to preface this very, very quickly. When I'm talking about refugee resettlement, there are believers who will say to me, well, are you against all refugees? Are we against all immigration? Well, first of all, I was an immigrant, right? I left Iran. I came to the United States. I waited 8 years to legally get my green card. and then another 8 years, almost 8 years, to become a legal U.S. citizen. So I have no problem with legal immigration, and I have no problem with us being a nation of immigrants to a limit. But I think the mistake we've made that Europe is now trying to wake up from is we have not limited immigration. I think our quotas are way too high, personally speaking. But that's a different issue. I certainly support some of the things that President Trump is talking about with like for example, ending chain migration, the visa lottery program, these fiancé visas, and some of this. Like right now, how many of you know right now we have over 100,000 Saudi foreign national students in America? Most people don't know that. How many of you know how much money the Saudis are pouring into our universities and textbooks? So there's a lot of aspects here that we don't know that are influencing our nation. We have the Fethullah Gulen charter schools. Many of them are in Texas. Government funded, where they are promoting, they have Islamic teachers promoting Islamism in a hidden way under the auspices of wonderful sounding charter schools that we're paying for. So these are things that are part of the equation. I believe that as a nation, there is a legitimate place for us accepting a limited amount of legitimate asylum seekers, refugees, limited. In that vein, shouldn't we as Christians be concerned about Christians who are being persecuted around the world? We're going to talk about that today. In that vein, shouldn't we, if we're worried about bringing refugees, shouldn't we be in favor of the government doing everything they can to vet refugees? I have heard, forget heard. I have documents. There's a document that was put forth back in 2015 by hundreds of evangelical leaders that said, we believe that security of the vetting is up to the government. Our job is to love and take care of the hurting and broken that are coming. This was a document. It was called a declaration on the evangelical response to the refugee crisis. The meeting was at Wheaton College, and it was the who's who of the sort of the emergent evangelical movement. My question is, the same group, this was when Obama was in power, and he was talking about bringing 110,000 refugees in 2017. The same group, when President Trump gets brought into power, when President Trump speaks of a temporary travel ban against 7 countries, takes out a full-page ad in the news and gets all these evangelical leaders to go against President Trump, saying it's unloving and uncompassionate, like it's unchristlike. Well, wait a second. In one breath, you said it's the government's job to take care of security. It's not our problem, which, by the way, I think is a cowardice response from the church. For us as shepherds and leaders to say, we're not worried about security. So as a shepherd in my church or as a shepherd here, should we not be worried about keeping the flock safe, both spiritually and physically? So that's a whole other argument we'll talk about. But these same groups are now working against this president because he wants to limit and screen and do a better job of those who are legitimate asylum seekers, which there are some. And I'll show you today that the Refugee Resettlement Program is a fraud. But let's, before we do that, define jihad, because we talked about jihad being the factor that warfare against non-Muslims. I mentioned to you the obligatory mention of nature of jihad. In section 09.1 of the Sharia law manual, the Reliance to Traveler, it speaks of this verse from Surah 495, that jihad is obligatory. What does the word obligatory mean? Mandatory, right? It's mandatory. It's not an option. It's mandatory. When they use the word permissible, that means it's optional. Obligatory means mandatory. It's mandatory for all Muslims. Those of the believers who are unhurt, meaning they're not disabled, but sit behind, they are not equal to those who fight in Allah's path, the mujahideen, with their property and lives. Now, is that not consistent with the Muslim Brotherhood statement we read earlier? Remember when it said in their mission statement that if the believers don't understand our mission and engage in jihad, then they are slackers? Remember that? So this is consistent with the teaching of the Quran. Allah has preferred those who fight with their property and lives. Now, how can this be a spiritual fight? It's not. We know it's literal and spiritual. A whole degree above those who sit behind. So if you fight with your property, meaning with money, and your life in jihad, you're way better to Allah than if you sit behind. Okay? Now, of course, it says to each Allah has promised good things. During the time of the Prophet, jihad was communal obligation after his immigration to Medina. Because what happened is they went to a non-Muslim land. So when Muslims go from a Muslim land to a non-Muslim land, jihad is communal. What does it mean communal? Meaning it's the responsibility of the Islamic community, ummah, but we're not going to hold every individual Muslim accountable yet. Why? They're in the lower house, right? Because we understand if you're in the lower house, some Muslims may not be able to overtly support jihad. So therefore, we understand that. We're going to give you some grace. But once you go, because that's what happened, remember, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. Muhammad called for the Hijra, that word there in Arabic means to migrate, from Mecca to Medina. Remember we talked about it last night. And so when that Hijra happens, remember who was in Yathrib, in Medina? It was the Jewish tribes. It was a non-Muslim land. So it's a communal obligation. It becomes a personal obligation now when they're in a Muslim land. Meaning now every Muslim better participate in jihad, otherwise we're going to hold you accountable. Which is why ISIS can go around killing Muslims, just like, because, one of the arguments we have, ISIS is not Islamic because they kill Muslims. That's nonsense. Muslims have been killing Muslims for 1,400 years. Because the devout Muslim says to the lukewarm Muslim, when they have control in the upper house, you either play along or we kill you. Remember, they can become an unbeliever, they can become a hypocrite, all the way up to an unbeliever. So it becomes a personal obligation when they're in a Muslim land. Does that make sense? Yeah. So communal, okay, we all have to participate, do whatever we can. Personal when it's the upper house, Dar al-Islam. Now, what's the objective of jihad according to the sacred law on the sacred manual on Islamic law, the Reliance of the Traveler? It tells us in section 09.8. This is going to become evident tomorrow when we talk about interfaith dialogue and the importance of the Muslim Brotherhood infiltrating our churches. The caliph, listen, this is verbatim quote out of here. I just put it on the screen. It's verbatim in section 09.8. The caliph makes war upon Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians because the list that is given about dhimmitude, remember we talked about last night that the secondary condition, convert, be dhimmi, or fight to the death, and pay the jizya, the dhimmitude. The dhimmitude is spelled out. It says the caliph must make an agreement of protection, a formal agreement of protection, with certain category of people. The first two on the category are Jews and Christians, because that's who Muhammad was dealing with predominantly. So, caliph says, make war upon Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, provided he has first called them to enter Islam. So the first thing they got to do is say, hey, will you convert? If we say no, thank you. If we say no, then invite them to enter the social order of Islam, paying the non-Muslim poll tax or jizya, dhimmi. So that's consistent with Surah chapter 9, verse 5, and then 29 to 33. If that doesn't work, war continues until they become Muslim or pay the non-Muslim poll tax. So they fight until they either convert or die. There's your three conditions that are consistent with the upper house. Right? Remember the lower house, Dar al-Harb. Oh, there's no compulsion. We want to just live in peace. We don't want to force you. That all goes out the window when they declare the upper house. Does that make sense? Yeah. So now Europe is upper house. That's why Muslims are openly preaching in enclaves that they've set up to non-Muslims. You need to repent and accept Sharia. You need to become a Muslim or get out. Why do you think these enclaves end up being 70, 80, 90% Muslim? One, a lot of them are coming in. Two, they're forcing non-Muslims out. It's a dual, it's inflow, outflow at the same time. Now, here's the kicker. The Sharia law manual says, and jihad continues until the time and place for which is before the final descent of Jesus. So they have to wage jihad until Jesus comes back and ends everything. Really? What is he going to do? After his final coming, nothing but Islam will be accepted from them. What happened to coexist? What happened to we're all going to live in peace and get along? It's going to be a multicultural utopia like Europe was supposed to be, right? For taking the poll tax is only effective until Jesus' descent. So remember the three conditions we just looked at? Convert, dhimmi, or fight to the death. Dhimmi is gone. Bye-bye dhimmi, no more dhimmi. You only have two choices left now when Jesus comes back, according to Islam. Either convert, or Jesus, and you'll see this tomorrow, will lead an army to kill all those non-Muslims. But you know, when we sit in interfaith dialogue, Muslims believe in Jesus, we believe in Jesus. We have so much in common. What fools we are being made of. We're being made fools of, aren't we? Because we buy this stuff. Now watch this. And when Jesus comes back, which is the divinely revealed law of Muhammad, watch this. When Jesus comes back, the coming of Jesus does not entail a separate divinely revealed law. So Jesus is not coming back to live by the Ten Commandments or the Gospels. For he will rule by the law of Muhammad. Now why doesn't it say the law of Allah? Why is it the law of Muhammad? Did Muhammad become God and I missed it? As for the prophets saying, I am the last, there will be no prophet after me, this does not contradict the final coming of Jesus, since he will not rule according to the evangel, meaning the gospel, but as a follower of our prophet. So Jesus will be a follower of Muhammad. This is the end goal of jihad. The end goal of jihad is not some spiritual struggle. The end goal of jihad is they literally believe that our Messiah is going to be a military figure coming back as a prophet to rule and reign. And you'll see this tomorrow even more. So with that in mind, now we have to look at why is Hijra a concern? Why is refugee and immigration a concern, particularly when it deals with the issue of Islam? Should we be extra concerned when we see mass Muslim refugee resettlement or mass Muslim immigration? Okay? In 622, as I mentioned last night, Muhammad immigrated from Mecca to Medina to gain power and control. This is why the Islamic calendar is AH, after Hijra. That's when Islam really began. Not in 601 when he claims he got the revelation in the cave by the jinn that really was a demon. Three things he called for. He said migrate, populate, and segregate. People don't like it when I say the third one. So migrate, we'll talk about in a minute. We're going to show you some more verses. Populate, we'll talk about. Population is actually, there's a jihad that is tied to that. Jihad walada means, hey, Muslim, remember how jihad is a communal obligation? Well, look, not everybody can fight with their property. And not everybody can fight with their lives literally, but here's how you can fight, good Muslim. Populate. You got your womb, use it. It is actually a form of jihad for Muslims to have lots of babies. And it is called jihad walada. Use your womb, because the more babies we have, the more Muslims we have, the quicker we're going to take over the world. The third part is a segregation, establishing enclaves. Now on the screen you see a picture. Does anybody want to guess where this is in America? I'll give you the clue, it's in America. No, it's not Detroit. Dearborn is close. No, it's not Minnesota. They're getting there, but Dearborn is about 42% Muslim now. But it's in Michigan. Hamtramck. Hamtramck, Michigan now is the first Muslim majority city in America. It's over 51% Muslim population, and it has the first Muslim majority city council. Remember we talked about hyper-political? Okay? So the fact that they say, well, Islam is not political, we don't want to whatever, is just that. Nonsense. Establishing enclaves meaning segregation. Now, all of this is the way jihad. Here's what Muhammad said in the hadith Amthil. I charge you with 5 of what Allah has charged me with. 1, assemble. 2, listen. 3, obey. 4, immigrate. And 5, wage jihad for the sake of Allah. So migration is a part of the struggle to establish Allah. Here's a verse in Surah 2:218. Indeed, from the Quran, indeed, those who have believed and those who immigrated and fought in the cause of Allah, those expect mercy of Allah. And Allah is forgiving and merciful. He's only forgiving and merciful if you do what He wants you to do. There's also verses in Surah 4, Surah 8, Surah 9, 20, 16 that references immigration as part of the will of Allah, because according to Muhammad, Allah told him, immigrate. Go over there with all your people. Remember abrogation, right? Remember, he abrogated. Here is Hadith Abu Dawood. Migration will continue until the sun rises from the west. Hijra would not be stopped until repentance is cut off. So Hijra for the Muslim is tied to jihad. When is jihad going to end? When Jesus comes back. No longer is there repentance, right? Because what's the option when Jesus comes back? Convert or die. There's no other option, meaning the repentance is become a Muslim, not I can stay a non-Muslim. So until repentance is cut off, and repentance will not be cut off until the sun rises from the west. So Hijra is a part of jihad. Migration is a strategy of Islam to gain strength. I'm going to show you a video here that speaks of the jihad walada, the call to populate. This imam spoke at Al-Aqsa Mosque back in 2015. Remember Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. And listen to what he says about about Europe and migration. Okay? And I'll give you a picture of what the strategy is.
كل أقطارها كلهم تقطر قلوبهم حقدا على المسلمين يتمنون لنا الموت ولكنهم فقدوا إخصابهم ويبحثون عن إخصاب عندنا سنخصبهم وسوف ننزل وسوف ننجب منهم لأننا سوف نفتح بلادهم رغم أنوفكم يا أيها الألمان يا أيها الأمريكان يا أيها الفرنسيون يا أيها الطليان يا كل من على وزن الطليان خذوا اللاجئين سنطلبهم منكم قريبا باسم دولة الخلافة القادمة وسنقول لكم هؤلاء أبناؤنا أرسلوهم أو نرسل لكم جيوش.
So they're called, now notice he's speaking in Arabic to an Islamic audience. Is he holding anything back? No. He's just telling them exactly what their plan is. We will conquer Europe. We will conquer America. We will conquer Germany. We will conquer Italy. Take our refugees. And we're going to breed with you. And guess what? When we breed with you, every one of those children is Muslim. That's why it is not against Islamic law for a Muslim man to either have a relationship, marry, or even rape a non-Muslim woman. Because, one, if they're a non-Muslim, they're unclean anyway. 2, it matters the religion of the father, not the mother. Does that make sense? So what they're saying to you is, look, we must wage this jihad, and population is the best way we can do it. Why? In Europe, we see a birth rate among Europeans of 1.45 on average. If you know anything about the numbers needed for population maintenance, that's not enough. The minimum you need is about 2.1 to maintain a population before it dies out. So Europe is dying out. We now have documentation back to Agenda 21 from 2001 that the United Nations addressed this issue and called for what they called population migration or population replacement. Because they looked at several Western countries, including the United States, and said, and Canada, Japan, Germany, of course, Western Europe, and they said, look, their birth rates are way too low. In 10, 15, 20 years, we're not going to have enough workers, enough tax base. We need to bring in more migration replacement. refugees. So some would say, oh, we've had a refugee crisis. I would say some of it may be allowed to happen because we need this migration replacement. So first in Europe, 30 years ago, was about cheap labor. That's where we're at in America right now. A lot of the support of refugees coming in is cheap labor. Meatpacking factories, Chobani yogurt in Twin Falls, Idaho. These areas where we go, Americans don't want to do those jobs. And so these companies get subsidies from the federal government to hire refugees. Maybe you knew that, maybe you didn't know that. But the issue is once that argument wears off, now it's a population argument. Meaning the Europeans aren't having enough babies. Well, we're going to have to make them have babies. One way or another, they're going to have babies. Which is why I believe insidiously, and I hate to even say this, the European governments have been absolutely blind to the rape epidemic that is in Europe. Sweden is the rape capital of the world. Norway is right up there with it. 77% of all rapes in Sweden are committed by young migrant males. Not all Muslim, but majority Muslim. It's a rape epidemic, and they're doing nothing about it. And I think there's an intentional purpose behind it. Because the goal is we got to get a population base. And so in Belgium, the #1 baby name for the 5th year in a row is Muhammad. In England, it's tied. There's European countries now that is very quickly, in most European, Western European countries, the #1 baby name born is going to be Muhammad. Now, there's some good news in Europe because there's a couple of countries that are waking up. Hungary said, we're shutting our borders, no more refugees, we're a Christian nation. Poland said, we're shutting our borders, we're a Christian nation. Czech Republic is following suit. Angela Merkel came out 2 weeks ago and finally admitted, there are no-go zones. And they're not good. Really, for years we've been saying, what about all these no-go zones? Oh, no, there's no no-go zones in Europe. Oh, well, we call them urban sensitive zones. Where police can't go, elected officials can't go, fire departments don't go, and basically it's run by Muslim gangs. So they finally admitted, and many people are speculating that the recent election in Italy, the #1 issue with the Italian voters was immigration. Just like with Brexit. So there are some European countries that are saying, you know what, they're actually trying to kill us. Meaning the European Union. They're allowing this Muslim infiltration. Germany has taken 1.2 million refugees. I can't even tell you all the things that are going on. So the birth rate is much higher. Well, guess what? In America, we are teetering at about 2.1 because we are not having enough children. So in Europe, what's the Muslim birth rate? On average, 4.7 to 5.1. The highest is in France, where it's at over 8. And that's not including multiple marriages. Remember, Muslims are within Sharia allowed to marry 4 wives. We don't even know how many children they would have with others who are not legally their wife, according to European law. So, you saw that immigration is part of jihad. You see that population increase is part of jihad. Now, is assimilation or segregation part of jihad? Let's listen to Linda Sarsour. Well, let's not really. I don't like listening to Linda Sarsour, but we're forced to listen to Linda Sarsour because she's just a miserable human being. She needs the Lord desperately. But here she is speaking at the ISNA conference this past June, last year. And she was giving a talk, and her talk was focused on Islamophobia and white supremacy. The Islamic Society of North America. Remember, one of the direct front groups. It's in the Sharia law or in the explanatory memorandum when they list their front groups. The very first one is ISNA. So it's a direct front group for the Muslim Brotherhood. By the way, it was the political outreach for the Brotherhood until they formed their political party back in 2015. So they have this conference. And she was talking about the White House and Trump, whatever. And there was an interesting thing she says that I want you to listen to and catch about whether they're going to assimilate or not. Listen to this. Sorry about the shrieking voice of Linda Sarsour.
Administration. And I hope that when we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad, that we are struggling against tyrants and rulers, not only abroad in the Middle East or in the other side of the world, but here in these United States of America, where you have fascists and white supremacists and Islamophobes reigning in the White House. We have to stay outraged. Do not criticize me when I say that we as a Muslim community in these United States of America have to be perpetually outraged every single. When I wake up in the morning and I remember who's sitting in the White House, I am outraged. This is not normal, sisters and brothers. Those people sitting in the most powerful seats in this country is not normal. So do not ever be those citizens that normalize this administration, because when the day comes that something horrific happens to us or to another community, you will be responsible for normalizing this administration. Our number one and top priority is to protect and defend our community. It is not to assimilate and to please any other people in authority. Our obligation is to our young people, is to our women, and make sure our women are protected in our community. And our top priority, even higher than all those priorities, is to please Allah and only Allah.
So I listened to this video about 18 times just to make sure I heard it right. Our top priority is we will not assimilate. It's to the Muslim community. And the highest priority is we're going to obey Allah and only Allah. What happened to the Constitution? What happened to our laws? Now, who is she talking to? A Muslim audience. The fact that they know this is going to be, they know this will go public. This is not a shock. This is not undercover. They're posting these videos, which means they're getting bolder with their message. And Linda Sarsour is right at the top echelon of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Muslim Sisterhood. So they're telling you, look, we're not going to assimilate. Wasn't that what we're seeing? Isn't that what we've seen in Europe? So all these Christian leaders are telling us, look, Muslim refugee resettlement is wonderful. They're going to come in and melt and blend, and we're going to be a utopic society. Talk to the European nationals and see how it's working for them. It's not working. They haven't. Why in Europe have they established so many enclaves? Why do we see Dearborn, Michigan, St. Cloud, Minnesota, Cedar Rapids, Minnesota, Murfreesboro, Tennessee? Why do we see places, Hamtramck, Michigan, where we now have Muslim enclaves in America? Is it an accident? No, it's their doctrine. Do you understand? It's a doctrine. Now, are there people that are using it? Yes. Just like in Europe, you have the globalists using it to destabilize Europe, right? Remember, they don't want borders. It's part of an antichrist system, isn't it? No borders, global government, global religion. In America, they're doing it as well. And initially, it's because they want one type of voter. Because guess how the illegals and the Muslims are voting en masse? Democrat. So remember I told you earlier, Abdul El-Sayed, look at his website. Every social justice progressive cause he's running on. And you go, well, Muslims shouldn't support those things. Yes, they shouldn't, but they're in the lower house. It's a house of war. So let's quickly talk about national security concerns, because lots of Christians and refugee agencies tell me, Shahram, you don't understand, Muslims, or these refugees are the most vetted. Refugees are the most vetted people coming into the country. You just don't understand. Well, we have testimony routinely from FBI, Homeland, National Counterterrorism, that there's no data collection for refugees from certain countries. That's why President Trump wanted to put a temporary halt on refugees from certain countries and or refugees from, for example, Iran that, want to kill us. So, disgraced former FBI Director James Comey, who had said before Congress, this is regarding Syrian refugees. This is back in early 2016. We can query our databases until the cows come home, but there will be nothing showing up because we have no record of them. It doesn't mean that we don't have a process of vetting. It means when you have a country like Syria, who do you call to get information? You go to the police department to find out, can you please send us the last 20 years of records on so-and-so? And when you talk to those in Homeland Security, because the process, and I'll try to explain to you as we go, but the process basically is this. The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugee Resettlement, they pick the refugees coming to America. We don't have a say. They then send those names to State Department. The State Department then sends those names to Homeland. Homeland is charged with vetting, not the FBI. The FBI has to clean up when they're here. Homeland vets, and when you talk to some folks in Homeland, they'll tell you, there's fraudulent passports, fraudulent birth certificates. Refugees are coming in with no fingerprints. A lot of times they're burned off. Refugees are coming in with the same birth dates, 0101, because there's no data collection process. We've had Phil Haney, right? I mentioned him earlier, whistleblower, worked at Homeland. He worked at Homeland, and his main job was the Islamic threat in America. And he wrote an open letter after he was forced out, and false charges were brought him by the Obama administration and the State Department, and he was forced out of Homeland. He testified before Congress. He wrote an open letter and testified. And here's what part of what he said. He said, based on what I have seen in the Department of Homeland Security, I no longer have confidence this administration can adequately vet or screen refugees or immigrants from Islamic countries. Now, that was under the Obama administration. Part of what President Trump was doing with the Justice Department and Homeland is they're trying to clean this up. But what have the left done? What have the Muslim Brotherhood done? What have the courts done? Fought it at every turn. And who has been there to support them? Evangelicals, the interfaith churches, because it's not loving. Remember, earlier before Trump, they said, not our job to worry about security. Government will take care of that. Now, under Trump, we got to get involved. It's not, this is a Muslim ban, right? That's the argument. So we have national security folks telling us that the process is broken. That's why we need to fix it. And we have the society, the left, the Democrats, the liberals, moderate Republicans, Christians fighting the process to try to save that, to try to fix it. Now, here is something that is also not fun, but I have to bring this up because one of the arguments that's made from pro-refugee folks is, look, refugees are the safest people coming in. That Declaration of Evangelical Response document literally said in it, and if you want to see it, come to the table, I'll show it to you, literally said in it, it is beyond these refugees that are coming from other countries to want to come to America. It is the furthest thing from them to want to come to America and do us harm. I'm going, when did these evangelical leaders become national security experts? Because I've spent time talking to those in INS, in Homeland, in FBI, dealing with hearing what they're saying about what's going on. So we have multiple examples of refugee arrest. Uzbeki Fazluddin Kurbanov from Boise, Idaho, came in as a refugee, claimed he was a Christian. Of course, we then later found out he lied. He really was a Muslim. He plotted to blow up a mall, attack a mall, and attack a military base in prison. 2 Sudanese and 1 Iraqi boy gang rape a young 5-year-old girl in Twin Falls, Idaho. Pretty well nothing happened. Somali Dahir Adan, remember the St. Cloud Mall stabbing? Somali Abdul Razak Ali Artan, Ohio State, remember with the car? Now, up to this point, the media and the left and the liberal Christians were saying no one's been killed. The judge in Seattle, the first travel ban that was injunctioned against because the Attorney General of the state of Washington went to a liberal judge in Seattle who later we found out helped bring refugees in, but there's no conflict of interest there. That judge asked the Justice Department, how many refugees have killed people in America? The Justice Department said, we don't know. And the judge said, I'll tell you, 0. That's in official transcripts. Well, the judge is wrong. Liban Mohammed, Aberdeen, South Dakota, tried to rape and kill. And then here we have the first refugee, official refugee killing, Sayfullah Saipov. Who is he? Remember Home Depot? I talked about earlier. He's the one who drove the Home Depot truck, came in under chain migration as a refugee, and killed 8 people, some of them who were visiting from Argentina. Remember, they were on their bikes and they got run over. We have multiple other, listen, I have a stack of cases. If you want a good source, a friend of mine, Leo Holman, who, if you go to Leo Holman, HOHMANN.com, Leo writes on this issue better than anybody. He's the only one that I know is willing to cover it. He just went to South Dakota, testified before the legislature, and gave a exhaustive list of multiple refugee arrests and attacks that really nothing much has been done about them because they're buried by the media. Because as you know, and I know, it doesn't fit the narrative, right? Because every refugee is a grandma with a little child coming in, fleeing persecution. They don't tell the stories of the majority of Syrian refugees coming in who are young men under the age of 30 or 35. They don't tell you these stories, like what's going on in Europe. We have ISIS that, of course, has promised and has infiltrated the refugee program. As I said, they are attracted to cheap labor. Jeff Sessions threw us a bone when he came in, when he finally showed that of the 1,000 current FBI cases for terrorism, over 300 involved refugees. Well, that changes the equation. That gives a lot more validity to the concerns of the Trump administration about saying, let's pause. Let's fix this. There's another great website, if you're interested, Ann Corcoran. Now, she's not a believer, but if on this issue of refugee resettlement, there is no one better that covers the whole thing. And her website, if you're interested, you want to know more, you want to educate your churches, her website, great information, factually based information, because she doesn't have a bias. She's not coming from any agenda other than to expose it. RefugeeResettlementWatch.wordpress.com. Here, I'll go back. Refugee Resettlement, RefugeeResettlementWatch.wordpress.com. So Refugee Resettlement Watch, all one word, then .wordpress.com. We got it? We're good? Okay. So, with all that said, don't you think that if we're talking about refugee resettlement, being compassionate Christians, shouldn't we have a kind of an honest dialogue about Christian persecuted refugees? Shouldn't we be wondering, are we allowing Christian refugees in? Remember the first travel ban that President Trump issued? He actually had language in there that said they want to focus more on Christian refugees, and the court struck that down. They said it's a Muslim ban, and they struck down the language about wanting to help Christians. So they had to rewrite that. So here are some numbers that I want to show you. So when you hear these refugee agencies and Christians espouse that we are compassionate, they're not telling you the full story. Here are the numbers from the Syrian refugees, because that's the most well kind of known recently. In 2016, Obama had said they wanted to bring 10,000, and they exceeded that. We're bringing in over 12,500. Since the Syrian crisis, the so-called civil war, 21,300 Syrian refugees from the best number. This is from the U.S. State Department's Refugee Processing Center. So this is from the government's numbers. We're not making this up. 21,300 have come in. So Syria is 10% Christian population. So you think you should see that reflected in the refugees, right? 98.28% of all the refugees coming in were Sunni Muslims, 20,933. 0.32% were Shia Muslims, 68. Christians were 0.115%, meaning a total of 245. A total of 245 Christians were brought in from Syria. Now, why are Christians not being brought in? A couple of reasons. One is we believe there was an actual block during the Obama era. Two, they're afraid to go into the refugee camps. Why? Because they're getting attacked in the refugee camps. So they're not even, many of them, in the pool for the UN, because they're literally worried for their lives even in the camps. So there's other ministries and agencies that are trying to help them. By the way, there's also that whole thing about the Yazidis. You remember, right? They're being sold into sexual slavery, and it's horrible, horrible. A total of 51 Yazidis have come in from Syria. So where is the outrage of the church about Christians not being allowed in? Does anybody hear that? All I hear is Trump is mean. It's the well, we'll get to some of the Christian arguments here in a little bit. But I hear a lot of the other side. I don't hear much of this side. In fact, I was invited to go speak at a so-called Christian college in Spokane, Washington in November of 2016, right after the election. They had invited World Relief, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, on their campus to give a talk about, it was a pro-refugee talk to the young people who were supposed to be the future Christian leaders. So then one of the conservative groups on campus invited me. We want you to come and give a counter talk. Basically, talk about immigration and refugee resettlement from a constitutional conservative viewpoint. Hopefully a biblical viewpoint. Okay, great. I'm all there. I'm there. So we set it up November 21st. On November 8th, 2 days after the election of Donald Trump, I get an email. Unfortunately, we have to cancel your speaking engagement because the students are too distraught after the election. We think that this is too volatile, not a good time. We'll talk to you at a later point. I haven't heard back from them since. Because what happens with this argument is, most of the time, the church is hearing one side of the equation. I'm all for, let's have a town hall meeting with the church. Bring World Relief, bring all these organizations, bring people like me. Let's put it all on the table. And let's make an informed and grace-filled decision about refugee resettlement. But my argument to those pastors would say, our duty is to these refugees, these foreigners coming among us, is my question is, what is your duty to your church and your community that you've been called to shepherd? Do we not have a duty? Those evangelicals that signed that declaration at Wheaton College said it's not our problem to worry about security. In my opinion, they need to be deprived of their pulpit because they have now abdicated their position as a shepherd. If a shepherd no longer is going to protect the sheep, then get out of the pulpit, with all due respect. In 2016, more Muslims came into the country than ever before. 39,000 Muslim refugees entered the U.S., most ever. Now, some potentially positive news on this front. Even with all the travel ban fiasco that President Trump has had to deal with, he still has the ability to determine the number of refugees. He has brought it from 110,000 to less than 25,000. He's trickled it down. Also, this number has come down. There are a few more Christians coming in, but still some being turned away. Just this past week, 100 Christians who were in Austria stuck, they had been promised they would be given access under the Obama administration, were turned back. And I got interviewed by the media, and I said, I don't believe that's coming from President Trump. I believe that's coming from the holdovers in the State Department. Because remember, they make the decision. Remember, the State Department makes that decision of specific refugees that are being allowed in. So, now that we know that we should be more aware and more vocal about Christian persecution and why Christians are not being allowed in. I mean, think about it. Our brothers and sisters in Christ are being massacred around the world in perhaps the greatest genocide in church history, numerically speaking. We have 50% of the Christian population in Syria that's been displaced. We have, by some estimates, 90% of the Christian population in Iraq that has been displaced. Christians are disappearing from the Middle East. And we're worried about how we can bring more Muslims into our country. I have a problem with that personally. And here's what I have a problem with. If this whole refugee thing is about money, I mean, it's not possible. It can't be just about money, could it? So, we have a group called the Evangelical Immigration Roundtable. Maybe you haven't heard about it. Maybe you have. Brandon House and I have covered this quite a bit of time on Worldview Weekend. I've done radio shows on this. And here's the thing, is that if you go to their website, Evangelical Immigration Roundtable, you'll see a lot of the who's who's of a lot of the emergent church movement, the Bill Hybels, the Tim Kellers, Matt Chandlers, Jim Wallace, and we know the Immigration Evangelical Roundtable has gotten funding from George Soros. Their whole premise is we as Christians are calling for immigration reform. What does that mean? That means we need to be more lax with borders, more lax with sanctuary, more compassionate for illegals who are here. They are now getting behind the concept of the DACA recipients. And of course, they are all in for refugee resettlement because they are part, many of the signatories here are part of the signers of that declaration that I mentioned. And oh, by the way, there's a video on there by a group of Christian female pastors that are talking about the stranger among you, the verse that Jesus talks about being the stranger among you and feeding and clothing. They're using that verse to say basically that you could be risking going to hell because if you were not helping those strangers among us. Oh, wait, hold on. I forgot to mention this. Did you see this? Did I miss this part? So these so-called Christian charities, and you'll see the list in a minute, are getting federal grant dollars. We're talking about close to a $2 billion kitty every year. So here are some of the groups. There are 9 major resettlement agencies that contract with the State Department. 9 major ones, and then they have local affiliates in local areas that contract with them. So we have Church World Services. Of course, that's a quote-unquote Christian entity. Ethiopian Community Development Council, that's a secular group. Episcopal Migration, EMM, again, Christian, supposedly. Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, International Rescue Committee, IRC, now, secular. Now, what are these numbers here on the screen? That is the percentage of their budget that comes from federal tax dollars. So 71% of the budget of Church World Services comes from you and I. International Rescue gives 66.5%. Episcopal Migration, 99.5% of their budget comes from federal tax dollars. But I thought this was the mission of the church. I thought that this is what Christians should be doing. That if that's the case, why are they not going in the church and raising money from within the church? For example, like Samaritan's Purse, Franklin Graham's ministry. They are raising money from within the church. They are helping refugees over there. U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, a secular group, 98%. Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services, 97%. United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, 97%. And World Relief, 72.8%. Just to give you an example of how much their staff is making, because by the way, none of that money goes to the refugees. That's all operational expenses. Here is Mark Hatfield, the president and CEO of the Hebrew Immigration Society. Remember, I'll go back here real quick. I went too far, sorry. Remember this one? The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Okay, so here's their, this is what year, this is 2015, I think, or 2016. I can't see here. Let me look on my computer. I think it's 2016. I need my glasses. Darn it, that's small. I believe it's from 2016, from Form 990 on the IRS. Can anybody see that? Does this say 2016? 2016. Okay. Here's his yearly salary. Can you see that? $316,455 to help refugees coming to the country. Here's the CFO, 276. Senior Advisor, 195. Senior VP, 198. External Affairs VP, 238. VP of Community Development, 172. Senior Director of Communications, 137. Senior Director of whatever, 168. Associate of Global Affairs, 146. Senior Director of blah, 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 143. We are in the wrong business. Every single staff member has a 6-figure salary. And yet this is all about helping poor refugees come into the country. It is a fleecing operation. Of the 9 major agencies, not one of their CEOs makes less than $300,000, including the CEO of World Relief. Not one. Yeah, do you think World Relief went to the college in Spokane, or when they go and speak at churches in our areas, and you think they told the Christians, by the way, here's how much money we're getting from the federal government? No, they don't say that. And oh, by the way, here's our salary that we're getting. They don't say that. It's our Christian duty to help these refugees. We should be welcoming, open the doors, and not resist any of them. That's what they tell you. And I haven't got to the worst of it yet. Here's the worst of it. The other dirty secret that they won't tell you is when they signed their contract with the State Department. This is exact language from the State Department's contract with these VOLAGs, Voluntary Local Agencies. Here it is. Once in the United States, this is paragraph 3, line 1 of their contract with the State Department. The Department of State has cooperative agreements with 9 domestic resettlement agencies to resettle refugees. While some of the agencies have religious affiliations, they are not allowed to proselytize. What does that mean? They have signed the contract, so-called Christian agencies, so-called Christian denominations, Catholic denominations or churches. They've signed the contract with the State Department saying, because we're getting federal tax dollars, we are prohibited from evangelizing. They've taken money to not share the gospel. Let me make it clear for us. They can't give them a Bible. They can't recommend a church. Now, if the Muslim says, can I have a Quran or a mosque? No problem. And yet they come and they go to our schools and they go to our seminaries and they go to mission festivals. Seattle Mission Festival last 2 years. 2 years ago, World Relief was the main speakers. This past year, it was all about refugees. And people like me are never invited because we're troublemakers. Right, Pastor Woods? You know how much of a troublemaker I am. Exactly. Thank you for inviting me here. Am I among troublemakers? Yay. Because Jesus was a troublemaker, wasn't he? This is the dirty secret that they're not telling Christians. And here's, forgive me, I spelled arguments wrong. Here are some of the arguments that they tell the Christians. And I don't have time to even go through these. But I just want to tell you some of the arguments that you may hear. Well, the reason we should help refugees is because Jesus was a refugee. Yeah, you're going, really? Exactly. Did I miss something? Because Jesus was a refugee, he went to Egypt. Well, hold on a second. Did he stay in Egypt? Did he get a job and live in Egypt? Did he plan on taking over Egypt? No. He wanted to share the gospel, I guess. One of these days he will. Yes, you're right. When he returns. That's true. That's true. But he came back to his homeland. But this is the argument they're making. Jesus was a refugee. Jesus was a Palestinian refugee. We are called to be kind to the stranger among us. You've heard that one? They'll cite Leviticus, Deuteronomy. The problem is they don't cite the whole verse out of context. The condition in Leviticus to the stranger among them that Israel had to welcome was, look, be kind to them, welcome them. However, they are subject to every law of Israel. Every law of Moses, and if they're not, they can be cast out or they can be stoned. Read the whole verse, read the context. They're cherry-picking verses out of the Bible to make an emotional argument, and they're such liars that they're not even telling the church how much money they're getting. And that because of that money, they've signed the compact that they won't share the gospel. I am going to go on a limb and say this is a condition where if Jesus came into these so-called churches or ministries, he'd overturn the tables. And say, you den of robbers. It's a blessing of Jesus to share with refugees. Well, yes, it's a blessing to share Jesus with refugees if we will do it. But you'll see tomorrow, if most of them are operating in a social gospel and it's about interfaith and ecumenicalism, they're not even sharing the true Jesus with them. And oh, by the way, what Jesus are they talking about? The one that Muslims believe is going to come back and, remember, kill everybody? God is bringing them to us. You've heard that one? This is a blessing. God is bringing the nations to us. I just did a 4-part teaching on this. And I believe the opposite is true. Every indication in the Old Testament was that when foreigners came among them in mass and infiltrated and brought their foreign gods, that was a sign of judgment, not blessing. Because they said to God, we forsake you. God had to remove his hand of protection. And as such, the enemies come within and bring their foreign gods. Every time they brought their foreign gods. And every time Israel got in trouble because they did what? They intermingled with those foreign gods, right? Now, the question is, they're among us. Yes, they're among us. What are we going to do with them? I hope you've seen from this presentation today that if we don't get bold, pray for boldness of the Holy Spirit with the gospel, and start going on the offensive with sharing the gospel with these Muslims that are in our communities, you see, and again, I'm not saying all of them, but you see the agenda that is there. What's the agenda? They're not going to assimilate. They're going to do what? Segregate. And they have their own agenda. If we don't evangelize them, and if God doesn't change their hearts for Christ, they have an agenda. We're almost done here. Again, I mentioned the Evangelical Immigration Roundtable. Check that out. Because they are promoters of open borders, immigration reform. They are promoters of being soft on sanctuary cities. The concept of illegals. Listen, I don't think I've quite been strong enough this week. Let me just say this thing. As a legal immigrant to this nation, and maybe some of you in this room share that, after waiting 16 years, I'm all for legal immigration, but get in line. I don't support anything that gives the pathway to citizenship where they jump ahead of other people. And why are we having these cities that are violating immigration laws? How many of you guys have studied? I know our next speaker is going to talk about our civil responsibilities. One of the things as Christians we need to understand is maybe we should read the laws that we're supposed to be subject to. Cities and states do not have purview over deciding whether they're going to violate immigration law. That is one of the only stated functions within the federal constitution on immigration and naturalization. Because otherwise, if that was the case, 50 states would have 50 different immigration laws. They're defying it. So we were talking about this at lunch, and amazing how those Christians who would tell us when we say to believers, the time is going to come, church, where you're going to have to say no to the government when they force us to do this, and this. And we get criticized for, you're rebelling against God. But now, when the shoe is flipped and it's an issue they care about, they're going to resist, right? It's our duty to resist Trump. That's what they tell. That's why World Relief is one of the ones who took that ad out I mentioned earlier. It was World Relief and World Vision who, along with the signers of the Declaration of Evangelical Response, took out an ad against President Trump after the first travel ban. And they've continued to do so. Now, I got to stop here. I just want to wrap up this section with this. I want to say it one more time because, someone will accuse me of saying, Shahram, you must hate refugees. Let me say it one more time. I do think as believers that there is a wise, truthful, compassionate response to this issue. There is a legitimate refugee crisis. There are legitimate refugees. Talk to Iranian Christians who have fled Iran who are being persecuted. Talk to any Christian from the Middle East who's being persecuted. I do think there's a legitimate place. But we should have a system in place for vetting. We should be wise, gentle as doves, wise as serpents. My final question is, I'm going to ask you this question. When you hear Christians who want to make this emotional, make it emotional. Okay, you think we should open the doors and let everybody in, even though if we don't have a good vetting process. All right, no problem. So tomorrow I'm going to send 10 people over to your house. Okay? You're going to feed them, clothe them, open your doors, welcome them in. You don't know who they are. We did background checks on them. Their names are John Smith. They all have John Smith. 01/01/01 is their birthday. We can't get any information on them, but trust us, they're vetted. And we're sending them to your house. You're going to take care of them. You're going to have them sleep in the next room to your children because it's the Christian thing to do. What would you say to me? You're nuts, right? Are you kidding? Wouldn't you say that person is a dereliction of their duty? If I as a father did that to my family, because as a father, as a shepherd of my home, I would say I'm not allowing anybody in who could be wolf among sheep. Maybe they're not, but could be. If they are sheep, or if they are those who could become sheep, praise God. But what's wrong with doing a proper vetting? What's wrong with letting the system play out? What's wrong with stop taking money? My supposition is the federal government needs to cut off this program, cut off every single tax dollar that's going. If these agencies believe it's such a Christian duty, great. Raise money from within the church. Do it for the right reasons. Don't take money from the federal government. Don't sign a contract that says you want to evangelize them. And maybe we can talk. Until that time, it's a fraudulent program. And we should be exposing it. And I've told people from World Relief, I said, as long as you keep lying to the Christian community, I will keep exposing you. Amen. So God bless you. And I'm going to go calm down, get my blood pressure down, and then we will see you back here tonight at 7:30. Oh, and by the way, please let this again, as I know, as Pastor is going to say, let this move our hearts to love those who are lost. Because once they're here, they need to hear the gospel. And that's the only thing that's going to change their hearts. So again, I pray this moves us to have a greater burden and passion. God bless you guys. Pastor, any questions I should take?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yes, Shahram, can you speak to any evangelistic groups that are focused toward Muslims, immigrant Muslims?
Other than Samaritan's Purse, these organizations and the denominations that they're involved in, everything they're focused on is social gospel based, meaning their focus is jobs, housing, healthcare, education, or getting clothing. Their focus is that. So other than Samaritan's Purse and other than individual church, I know individual churches. I talked to a pastor in South Dakota. Their church is beginning to have once a month a time where they're inviting Muslims from the community to come, and they have speakers that come, not Muslim speakers, speakers that come and share the gospel. They're trying to be open with it. They have a meal. They try to cater. There's some outreach there in that sense, but those are individual churches. There's not an organization other than Samaritan's Purse that I know of that is actually sharing the gospel with refugees that are coming in. Everything that I see is social-based works. It's based on getting along, peace, how do we help them? Now, that's not in and of itself a bad thing in the sense of if our works opens the door for the gospel. The problem is they're not sharing the gospel, and as you see, part of the reason is why? Because if they're affiliated with one of those agencies, the churches are, those agencies could lose their contracts.
Is there one that's geared toward Muslims in general?
Either refugees or non-refugees?
Well, there's lots of ministries that are, I mean, my own spiritual father from Iran, their ministry, Hayat Abadi, which means eternal life, is specifically geared towards Muslims. They do satellite radio ministry, internet, in the U.S. and abroad. They're in the U.S. They do ministry, for example, they minister to Muslims in Southern California. As I said, there's a large Iranian population in Southern California. So yeah, there are Usama Daddock, the straightway.org. Usama does ministry to Arab-speaking Muslims to reach them for Christ. So yes, there are ministries that are good ministries in the U.S. that are evangelizing. I thought you meant on the refugee side. Those that are working explicitly on the refugee replacement, we don't see any evangelism other than Samaritans, because as I said, one of the missions of Samaritans is they believe keep them close to their home country as possible. So if they're coming out of those war-torn areas, keep them in other countries. So here's my question to the Muslims and to the Muslim Brotherhood, who's all behind refugee resettlement. Why hasn't Saudi taken one refugee? Why hasn't Dubai taken one refugee? Why hasn't Kuwait taken one refugee? All of the rich Muslim countries have taken 0 refugees. Now you have Jordan that's taken some, Turkey has taken some, Lebanon has taken some, but the ones with the big bucks, none. The Saudis every year for Hajj, they set up tents in the middle of a desert with air conditioning units in it for the pilgrims that come from Mecca for Hajj. They can do that, but they can't take one refugee in. And why aren't those rich Muslim countries taking Palestinians in? So I hope that helps. Yes? Yes, ma'am.
You've probably seen or read, there have been 7, these are all Democrats, representatives who have been singled out by some Republicans for associating with Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam.
Right.
Could you please address, I mean, in my opinion, Nation of Islam is completely Islam. If they have, I saw a presentation by Farrakhan, and Allah is clearly in the background. Is there any difference in your observation?
Yes, that's a great question on Nation of Islam. The SPLC has listed the Nation of Islam as a hate group, which was surprising to us. Part of the reason, I believe, is that even though Farrakhan believes that he is a Muslim and supporting Islam, and they are, in their view. The way that Islam views the Nation of Islam is as basically a cult. So they are viewed as not true Muslims. Here's part of the reason. If you don't think there's racism in Islam, then we don't know Islam. Black Muslims are always viewed as lesser than Arab Muslims. if you go to Mecca for pilgrimage and the way they have the setup of those who can get closer access to the Kaaba and those who are further, the African black Muslims always get the back of the line because they're viewed as lesser than. So both theologically and because predominantly, as you know, Nation of Islam was, were black Muslims, they're viewed as outside and a cult within Islam. They're not recognized. Now, Farrakhan, of course, is very anti-Semitic. He's very clearly shown his true colors there, and they support the Muslim Brotherhood, but it's not reciprocal in the recognition of it. So we know that there's some workings together, but they're not officially recognized as true Muslims. And a lot of it is because, this is a dirty secret within Islam, is because there's racism. Islam is still, by the way, you guys know slave trading is still going on, right?
Yeah. So they haven't heard of the Civil Rights Act yet?
Apparently not, even though that was...
Wait, one more question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the schools, charter schools.
Yes, ma'am.
Is it true that that's Harmony?
Harmony is
our
one
Harmony
of those
schools here?
Correct.
In Houston?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Federally funded, Fethullah Gulen, under those names. So you got to dig into those schools, dig to their background, and see. And I would recommend, if kids are associated with it, pull them out of those schools, because those are Fethullah Gulen. It's an Islamist movement. So again, this is where we have to expose, right? We're part of the majority of the ministry that we're doing is to bring light and expose so that we can bring correction. Tonight I'm going to expose a little bit more on Sharia. Tomorrow we'll get into the beginning of the equipping process, bringing correction and ultimately leaving here with a full commitment to biblical evangelism and sharing the gospel with those that are lost. So hang in there. We're getting there. And again, God bless you guys. Thank you for your grace towards me. I'm deeply appreciative of it.
Okay, great.